Hi everyone, this lesson is on the personal life perspective on the family. So we're firstly going to look at the criticisms of the structural theories that we've looked at so far, so functionalism, Marxism and feminism, and then we're going to start looking at this new perspective. So just here I've got a sort of diagram that helps us to understand where all of these approaches fit in the sort of grand scheme of things. So in sociology we've got two basic approaches, the macro approach and the micro approach. So the macro approach is all of the structural theories we've been looking at. And what that means is, structural approaches are ones that look at how structures in our society affect our behaviour. So how school, peer groups, families, the courts, all of that, how that affects our behaviour. And they can be broken down into two types, consensus approaches and conflict approaches. Consensus approaches have the assumption that we are all in consensus with one another, and the conflict approaches have the assumption we conflict with one another. Obviously with Marxists the conflict is between the different class groups, and with feminism the conflict is between different genders. On the other hand, you've got action theory, so this is the micro approaches that look at how our personal interactions with one another affect our behaviour. So we're not looking at big structures and how they impact us. We're looking at our sort of one-to-one relationships or small group interactions with each other. So this is usually called interpretivism, and there are lots of different branches of interpretivism. You've got interactionism, postmodernism, ethnomethodology, phenomenology, and we've got here personal life perspective, which is what we're going to be looking at today. So the personal life perspective doesn't look at how structures in society affect our interactions in our family life. They look at our personal interactions with one another and how that shapes what our family life is like. So the criticisms of the structural approaches, so I've got this diagram here which has society is like this big machine, and we are puppets that are controlled by these structures in society. And this is one of the problems with structural approaches. It assumes that we are all kind of puppets. We are all just being controlled by these wider social structures, and that we don't really have any agency. We don't have any way to determine our family types or our roles or our relationships or our futures. It assumes that we are all controlled and that we don't have any sort of agency over our own lives. And obviously we can say that that's just not true. There are lots of arguments to suggest that we do have choice over the way our life is, our gender roles, our relationships. We are not necessarily puppets in the way that Marxists, feminists and functionalists assume. All of these theories as well, you'll have noticed when we've studied them, all assume that the traditional nuclear family is the dominant family type. And we know that again, it might be the dominant family type, but it's certainly not the only family type, and that we should be looking at other family types because family is more diverse in the UK than ever before. So this is why we need a different perspective, the sociology of personal life. So this is a new perspective on families, relatively speaking, and it's influenced by the interactionist school of thought, and argues that in order to understand families, we must start from the point of view that individuals are concerned and the meaning that they give to their relationships. So this is known as the micro or the bottom-up approach, and it draws our attention to other personal or intimate relationships that individuals might see as significant. So I've put some pictures here of other sort of groups or people that people might see as important in their family relationships. So you might consider, for example, a best friend as being important to you in terms of your family. Another key term that you might not have heard of before is chosen family. So this is when somebody perhaps chooses a group of people to be their intimate family rather than their blood relatives, because either their blood relatives don't understand them or they have less in common with them. So often this might be seen in the LGBT community, where people will choose family members rather than their blood relatives. Another key term that you need to know is fictive kin. So this is people who we are not blood related to, but who are very closely tied to our family. So it might be, for example, when you've got a family friend and you're raised to call them auntie or uncle, even though they aren't your biological auntie or uncle. You might call them that because you are told that they have a certain status or respect in your family, even though they're not a relative. Some might consider deceased people as still part of their family and still significant in their life. And then lastly, the personal life perspective looks at pets as well. So pets being, something that is really important in family life. So there's a couple of sociologists that I want you to look at. So this first one here has a link, and this one looks at the role of, sort of lesbian couples who want to start a family, and some of the complexities of starting a family and the sort of assumptions around roles and things like that with lesbian couples that want to have a family. And then the second one also looks at donor families, families that are perhaps using a donor to conceive, and what's the role of that donor in the family? Are they integral to the family? Do they have a relationship with the people that they are donating to? They obviously have a different role legally compared to what they might actually have in a child's life. So the biological parent is usually on the birth certificate, even if they don't have any kind of relationship with them going forwards. So I want you just to watch those two clips and answer those questions, because it helps us to understand some of the ways in which family life has become more complex in recent years. And it helps us to perhaps move away from looking at that analysis of the family just from the standpoint of looking at only nuclear families. So then we have to think about some of the problems with the personal life perspective. Firstly, we can say that it's very broad. The fact that it encompasses, people that we are not blood related to, animals, etc. Arguably, it's too broad, and practically anyone or anything could be considered family under this definition. So it might not be very useful as a sociologist if you're trying to study society. And lastly, you can also say that it's criticised for ignoring what is special about relationships that are based on blood or marriage. Certainly functionalists would make that criticism, and they would say that, again, it's not only too broad, but it's ignoring, what is it that's special about us being related to one another, having those ties that are based on blood or marriage. So lastly, what I'd like you to do is have a look at this question. So evaluate the usefulness of structural approaches to our understanding of families and households. The item is on in the textbook at the end of the theory section, so you can look at it there. But remember, for this question, you don't have to use the item explicitly. So you can answer it without it, but obviously reading the item will give you clues as to what sort of things you could talk about. So we're looking at our structural approaches useful for our understanding of families and households. And we're going to look at these three structural approaches. And then this approach that we've just looked at today, the personal life perspective, is not obviously a structural approach. It's an interactionist micro approach. So we can use that to say, well, actually, maybe all structural approaches are not that useful. And maybe it's, micro approaches are much better. So I've got here a practice paragraph, or sort of model paragraph of what I might say in terms of functionalism. So I'd want to obviously tell the examiner what functionalism is and what their perspective is on the family, and then I want to evaluate it with a criticism of why this perspective arguably is not that useful. So this would be the first section of my 20-mark answer. For your second section, you would want to talk about a different structural perspective like Marxism or feminism, or you can go on to talk about personal life perspective and say, well, actually, none of the structural approaches are useful, and the personal life perspective is the most useful. Obviously, you're going to aim to talk about all of these at some point in the essay, but it might be worth talking about personal life perspective next, so you've got a direct contrast between structural and non-structural approaches. So when writing the next paragraphs, you might want to use other phrases like this. So a more useful approach would be, or this approach is more useful than the functionalist approach because, and I've just put again, remember the personal life perspective is not a structural approach. Functionalism, Marxism and feminism are. So you might want to save that to your final paragraph to criticise all the others if you're writing the whole thing. But all I want you to do is to write the second paragraph. So look at the first paragraph on the previous slide. Make sure that you follow the same structure and choose from any of these perspectives below. So you can choose what one you do. Obviously, don't do functionalism because it's been done for you. And see if you can evaluate how useful that approach is. So why is it useful for our understanding of families and households? And also remember that criticism as to why it is flawed. Can you make sure that, please, you just upload the paragraph to show my homework? And you can upload the answers to the video questions as well if you'd like me to take a look at those as well. Thanks very much. Bye.